Charlie.
Before the break, I was asking you about the PIP stockpile and the contractual arrangements around the management of that, so we'll carry on from there. Did SCCL have visibility of the state of the stockpile in England, the PIP stockpile in England?
Yes, yeah, we had no responsibility for any of the other devolved nations.
No. Can we have up on screen, please, INQ 000330795? This document shows the status of the PIP stockpile in England. We see there England figures only at row 5, and it's updated on the 27th of January 2020. There's information within this table around stock levels, but also expiry dates and the status of certain items in the PIP stockpile. In respect of surgical face masks, there's a note that says no significant volume expires until 2021. But we also see that of the 156 million, 84 million of these have no labelled expiry date and are currently undergoing QA testing. Is that quality assurance testing?
Yes, sorry.
Yes, to demonstrate the product remains fit for use. So the reality is, in relation to surgical face masks, there was a significant proportion in respect of which the expiry date wasn't known in January 2020. Is that right?
I don't know enough to be able to tell you confidently, I'm afraid. I've seen this last week, but I'm not sure from where it comes.
Right. So this level of detail contained in this table when we talk about visibility of the stockpile, would SCCL have been aware of this level of detail about the status of the items in the stockpile?
My honest answer is I don't know. My assumption is yes,
Right.
but I'm afraid I couldn't tell you with any certainty, I'm afraid.
It's all right, it was a long time ago. The table also tells us, in relation to FFP3 valved respirators, that stocks were stressed, and that it was expected that by the 1st of April 2020 there would be around 1.3 million in date. By the 1st of April 2020, we expect circa 1.3 million to be in date under 120k by August 2020. But there was also work going on in respect of shelf life extension there and the activation of JIT, is that just-in-time
Yes.
arrangements for delivery in between 5 to 11 weeks. Looking at that, there were a number of key items that were required for the pandemic response within the stockpile, in respect of which work was ongoing simply to ascertain whether they were still safe for use. Does this reflect, in your view, a properly managed PIP stockpile?
Well, I think you have to remember that it's for a stockpile for a different pandemic to the one that then transpires. But it seems to me that the system of understanding when products will expire and which of those are capable of being given additional shelf life by further testing is sensible, and being on top of how many of those there are would appear to be a sensible approach.
Certainly having the information at your fingertips is important. In relation to having the stockpile ready to deploy when faced with a pandemic, this is not the optimum status of a stockpile that's ready for use, is it?
I'm not sure why not.
If there's a stockpile in respect of which there are significant numbers of key items that have to undergo testing in order to determine whether they are safe to be deployed, would you agree that
But that's about extending their shelf life beyond the current shelf life, which is largely done by the manufacturers to provide their own confirmation that that product remains fit for purpose for an additional period. So what it does is it avoids the need to take stuff out of the stockpile and then buy new in. So it's a case of active stock management as opposed to, at any point in time, products that have come in will be nearing the end of a shelf life.
All right, well, just staying with the example of the FFP3 valve respirators that we have in the table, the first line there is respirator volumes are currently stressed. So there were pressures around the stocks of those items, do we agree?
That's my assumption based on that, yes.
All right, and then the next sentence is by the 1st of April 2020, we expect circa 1.3 million to be in date. So as at January 2020, which is the date at which this table was put together, there was uncertainty. There was an expectation that 1.3 million would be in date, but that wasn't a given, was it? And that they would be in date at a future date, so not until April 2020.
But then the next line does say then, however, that there's going to be 4.6 million that we think will be shelf life extended. So I guess it is a snapshot in time, and I can't give you very much more information than that, I'm afraid.
All right. Just one final question on this table, and then we can take it down. Would you agree that more of the stockpile should have been ready to go without the need to extend its shelf life or carry out QA testing when it is needed to be deployed? A greater proportion should be ready to go at any given moment.
I've never been responsible for managing a stockpile, so I'm talking from a position of ignorance. But what I see here is that there is what would have been considered a sufficient number of products available in the stockpile, and there would then have been this table, I imagine, would have been discussed between SCCL and PHE, and decisions made as to whether additional products are required to be purchased, whether products should go back in for retesting or additional shelf life. So the decisions would be being made on a regular basis based on the information that is included here to ensure that at all times the stockpile had what was expected to be needed.
Thank you. We can take the table off the screen now. Thank you. Professor Sanchez-Grails, who's provided evidence to this inquiry, has said that the control and management of the PIP stockpile had been under a complex chain of contracts, and that this contractual complexity, as he put it, created operational difficulties, and that it also affected the procurement of goods to replenish the stockpile. For example, in the case of items running out of date. Would you agree with that characterisation?
Well, I think he makes that statement more widely about the whole model, and I'm not sure I would agree. I don't think it has the level of complexity that he is suggesting it does. As we talked about before lunch, each of the 11 towers were responsible for a number of items, and therefore they were solely responsible for buying those items. So there wasn't that level of complexity about who would be buying the items. And as I said before, we were the sort of overarching customer point or customer-facing element. So I know he talks a lot about complexity. I think it is probably not as complex as he suggests it is.
Dame Emily Lawson said the tower structure was complicated.
She did. I don't think in practice it was as complicated as it might look. I appreciate that looking at it on screen, it looks complicated. But the idea of that each of the products was in only one category meant that you are effectively asking people to have speciality and knowledge of only a smaller proportion of products, as opposed to the whole. We have 600,000 products in the catalogue at the moment. So rather than having to have knowledge of all 600,000, you're looking at the however many thousand that will make up your particular areas of expertise. I think in practice it's probably more simple than it looks, but I do understand that to the outside world it looks incredibly complicated.
Just to wrap up questions around the PIP stockpile then, as far as you can recall, was SCCL satisfied with how it was being administered by its contractor?
Yes, there were no contractual issues.
Moving on then to the events early in the pandemic, so from early 2020. You've described in your statement that trusts started significantly increasing their orders, and we know from other witnesses that, of course, at the same time, supply chains around the world were disrupted, and obviously that affected the work of SCCL as well. Lockdowns abroad halted production of some items, is that right?
Yes, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that there was problems, for worldwide supply chains.
And there were also shipping delays and export bans.
Yes.
All right. In terms of how that impacted the work of SCCL, some witnesses have referred to SCCL's contractual arrangements collapsing when faced with this global market disruption. How would you characterise the effect of global market disruption on, let's speak first about the business as usual contracts that were in place?
Well, the business as usual, so as I said earlier on, business as usual included very, very small elements of PPE, 100 million out of 3.5 billion. And those other products are those that allow a hospital to operate on a daily basis. It's all of the products that are used in everyday procedures, in operations, and including food as well. So without those products, a hospital doesn't function. And if our supply chain breaks, then hospitals very quickly are unable to operate as they are intended to do. That element of the business was what we focused on keeping going, and we continued to deliver right the way through the pandemic and beyond with very high levels of delivery. There were obviously some products that were harder to source and also subject to, as you said, the delivery delays in shipping and the like. But by and large, the business as usual element, which is the vast majority of the business, kept going, kept delivering, and a significant number of people involved in the supply chain working ferociously hard to ensure that that was the case. The problem comes when you then add PPE on top of, or the demand for PPE on top of what is a finite resourced supply chain, and ask it to deliver products that have grown exponentially in terms of demand. We have a finite number of warehouses and a finite number of lorries to do deliveries. And we were only ever set up to deliver products to 240 NHS trusts. Being asked then to deliver PPE in volumes that were so significant, and then ultimately to 58,000 locations, means that that's just not sustainable. And
the 58,000 locations you mentioned, that's a reference to when does that include care settings?
Yes, so that was where the PPE was then ultimately being delivered to. So when we talked before about our market share, so we were a business set up to manage roughly 50-60% of the hospital's daily, or NHS Trust's hospitals' daily requirements. and did that, and our capacity allows us to meet those levels. It just wouldn't have existed or survived had we been able to or been required to add the levels of PPE, such that even the 800 people you heard about last week in terms of doing the buying, 2 parallel supply chains through Clipper.
The long and short of it is however, that had the parallel supply chain not been set up, had the procurement of PPE not been effectively taken out of the hands of SCCL, SCCL would have been unable to provide what the NHS needed.
Absolutely. Yeah. But we'd have had to make a choice. Do you either buy PPE and then not provide any of the products that the NHS actually needs to be able to deliver, or do you split it up? The decision, it seems like the decision was eminently sensible.
You've described in your statement the amount by which demand for all items, not only PPE, but of course including PPE, surged, and NHS trusts were placing much larger orders than they had been historically. And NHS trusts that hadn't placed orders with SCCL began to do so.
Yes.
Is that right? Now, one of the ways SCCL responded to that, and we know that SCCL was liaising with DHSE, and we've heard from Dame Emily Lawson about her involvement. One of the ways SCCL responded to that was through instituting demand management. In simple terms, does that mean cancelling down orders placed by NHS trusts?
In some cases, but most certainly initially, in looking at those anomalies in ordering patterns, I think Dame Emily referred to 150% as, so if somebody had normally ordered 100 and was suddenly asking for 150, someone would question whether that was needed, because it was just simply a question of trying to make sure that as many customers got as many products as we could give them with a, as you said, an increasing customer base, customers who'd never bought certain items from us coming to us because their existing routes no longer existed.
And is it right that there was no centralised information on inventory? So, for example, SCCL couldn't know how much stock was held, whether as a buffer or for immediate use by any given NHS trust?
That's absolutely correct, and that's one of the biggest problems we faced is knowing how, if somebody was ordering 1,000, did they already have 1,000 in stock, or was it because they had absolutely none? And so knowing where stock was and how much stock existed was impossible, and to a large extent still remains the case now.
You've said in your statement at paragraph 7.32, your statement INQ 000492085, that demand control rationing was not routinely communicated widely at the start of the pandemic, as this often serves to encourage customers to place multiple orders to get around any rationing, which defeats the objective of ensuring all orders are fulfilled at least in part, i.e. a fair share goes to all customers. You've given a reason there for not routinely communicating widely rationing or control. Well, firstly, what do you mean by not communicating widely? How was rationing communicated to NHS customers?
My understanding or recollection is that trusts were informed both by the department and others not to stockpile, and I think in one of the earlier paragraphs at the top of that page there is the information that we sent out to trusts explaining that we were trying to meet as many people's demand as possible. But what we didn't do is say we are now only going to allow X number of products or X percent of your orders to be fulfilled, because that did breed the sort of stockpiling behaviour in some cases that not dissimilar to we saw in supermarkets and whatever, people buying as much as they could, not necessarily as much as they needed.
Can I just take you back? I'm sorry to interrupt, Ms. Sherrick. Can I just take you back to one of your answers a minute ago? You said that one of the problems, as was put to you, was that the difficulties in knowing how much stock trusts held. And you said that that's still the case. Dame Emily said that there is now in place a system whereby, in an emergency, SCCL could find out. And the systems could talk to each other.
And again, my recollection may not be quite right. I think she talked about the number of trusts that have inventory management systems in place, and that certainly isn't all. My understanding is there are about 60 or 70 trusts that have an inventory management system that is capable of talking to us or providing reports. But it's certainly not the full extent of the NHS, and we are working on a project with NHS England to introduce inventory management systems into 20 new trusts to give us real-time data that will say, so it wouldn't just, so I know that Dame Emily was talking about it being an use in emergency, but for actually a supply chain business like ours, we want to have that information all day, every day. We want to know how many bandages you've got, how many sutures you've got, so that we can help manage that. And some of the particularly some of those products that are used in operating theatres, for example, as they're being used, we know that that's one less unit, and at a point we'll place a reorder without the trust having to do anything. So it's that kind of data that we just didn't have going into the pandemic, and largely we don't have as a system even now.
So 60 you already got this new management system.
That's my understanding.
20 you're rolling it out to.
Yes.
Remind me how many trusts there are?
About 240.
So you've got a long way to go.
Yes, and it's not cheap, and that's the trouble. There's a benefit to it, but I think our number one recommendation, certainly from our perspective, is that if the money can be found, inventory management systems in throughout the NHS would be a benefit.
Thank you. Sorry to interrupt.
Finally, on this point, did SCCL consider that NHS trusts might have been concerned that they weren't able to source PP from SCCL? And this in itself might have caused panic buying if they weren't being communicated with.
I think it's less about the communication, but more about the concern. I think the concern that you outline is very real. You suddenly need a quantity of products that you've never bought in that volume before. The place that you may have typically bought from doesn't have access to it, and then what you think is the sort of NHS's own supply chain also doesn't have it, certainly in the volume. So that kind of concern and fear element, I think, is only natural.
Is it right to say that SCCL did not have plans in place that anticipated a pandemic?
SCCL we managed the PIP stockpile, so that was our understanding of what the pandemic plan would have been. So we would have, and the contract that we had with PHE and with Movianto made clear all the steps that would happen and how that stockpile would be deployed. So to that extent, there was a plan.
In terms of supply chain disruption, in terms of what would happen once the stockpile had been used up, SCCL didn't have a plan as to what came next, did it?
No, but I'm not sure that in that circumstance we would have been expected to, because again we take instructions from PHE about the volume and the nature of the products to be put in the stockpile, and so and again my understanding is the expectation was that PIP stockpile would have been sufficient. I can't remember, I've got the number in my statement, the first X weeks of a flu type pandemic, so there would have been an expectation then that would have been replenished. So I think there was a plan, but in terms of did we have a separate plan, no, we didn't. But I'm not sure there was an expectation that we should have done, because we would have been operating under the instruction of PHE, who would be making all the calls about whether there was a pandemic, when to deploy that stockpile, and in what form.
You now have in place something you refer to as a pandemic playbook. Does that address?
Some of that is an internal facing in terms of, in terms of how we deploy our own resources. We had lots of people working incredibly hard, but then we've still got on PPE, ignoring the difficulty of maintaining the BAU ways of working. So we have a greater level of planning as to how we would manage, because again, like the rest of the country, we were dealing with people not being able to get into the office. Skipton House, where Dame Emily Lawson was based, was where we were largely based. That was shut down, and it's all of that kind of how do you work in a pandemic. So that's in our plan. We have the ability to scale up should we need to reopen effectively the parallel supply chain, that kind of thing. So all of that is in there. But again, a large amount of that, we will be acting under the instruction of whether it's UK HSA, the Department of Health, or NHS England, depending on who's calling the shots at that point.
Thank you. And you go into more detail about that in your written evidence, for which we're grateful. I'm just going to move very swiftly on to the physical warehouses. We've heard a bit about that.
Yes.
This morning, there's a distinction between a distribution warehouse and a storage warehouse, if I can put it in those terms. You say in your statement that the Haydock warehouse was accessible 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Am I right in saying that in respect of distribution of the stockpile, your analysis is that the issue wasn't with logistical or physical issues, but rather it was around measuring and monitoring demand signals?
Yes, that's right.
Can I put up on screen, please, INQ 000-56977? This is an extract from an account by Matt Hancock in his book entitled The Pandemic Diaries. If we go to pages 6 and 7 of that document, that's printed pages 95, 96. Thank you very much. I just want to ask you about the way he describes the difficulties with the warehouse. Continuing to work through the practicalities, Steve Oldfield updated me on the huge stocks of PP in a warehouse in the northwest. 1 billion items, just one problem, we can't get it out. It turns out that when they laid down the PP stockpile in the 2000s, no one thought about the circumstances under which we might need it, i.e. an emergency in which time is of the essence. It's a huge storage unit which only has one door. Just pausing there, on a factual level, is it accurate that the Haydock site only had one door?
I don't believe that is the case. In fact,
all right. And in terms of the difficulties with moving something out of deep storage into a distribution warehouse, would you accept that that process in and of itself takes up valuable time that isn't available in an emergency?
No, because we can demonstrate that at one point they moved 1,000 pallets in a 24-hour period. I don't know where the information came that goes into this extract, but I wanted to check before I came here, and one of my colleagues has showed me that if you put the Haydock site into Google Maps, you'll see that there are a dozen lorries all loading up at the same time. So I think there is some misinformation in terms of how this story has been relayed. Undeniably, it is quicker to move product from a distribution warehouse because because the stuff is coming in and going out on a daily basis. Deep storage is there for a particular period, but it's a modern facility with modern technology, and as I said, capable of moving 1,000 pallets in 24 hours. So the stock can be moved. Now, Dame Emily Lawson gave an incredibly articulate explanation of what happens next in terms of then being transported to and being broken down into the right size of packaging or parcels, depending on the nature of the organisation then receiving the products, because obviously it's different if you're going to an NHS trust to if you're going to a care setting. But I'm not aware that the problems that this suggests in terms of ability to access stock and then move it around the country are anything like as they're portrayed here.
All right, and then finally, you tell us in your statement that SCCL has now brought the procurement of PPE in-house.
Yes.
What does that mean, and how will that affect preparedness in a future pandemic?
So that chart that you showed at the start of the session has now been largely rubbed out. The procurement of medical products, so 8 of those 11 towers, has come in-house, in part as a recognition that if there was an emergency situation, being able to deploy those procurement people to buy particular products rather than the range. So previously they only bought whatever capital equipment. Now we can say, actually, you are now buying PPE or you're now buying whatever it is. So there's an element of building some greater level of control over our staff and our procurement patterns. It will help us a bit with resilience as well, and it means that the decisions we will be able to respond quicker to direction from NHS England or the department without having to go to a third party, which is what the case was with the towers.
Thank you. My lady, I'm conscious there are questions from others, but those are all.
Thank you very much. Mr Weatherby.
Yes, my lady, I'm asked to shorten my
Well, I'm sorry, it's
questions.
because we've run over, but
No.
if you can't without affecting the substance, then...
Well, I was about to say you covered parts of them anyway, but
All right.
can I just have a quick...
Yes, of course.
quick go? Mr Webster, I ask questions on behalf of bereaved families, who are members of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. And my lady was asking you questions about the inventory system or the lack of inventory systems in trusts, and you gave us your answer about that. In your witness statement, you described it as a major difficulty with the system. The SCCL had an idea of what was being ordered by trust, but it had no way of tracking what the individual trusts actually already had. And that gave rise to serious issues, your words, during the pandemic, because it was impossible to know how much stock of a particular product a specific trust or the wider system held. Okay?
Yes.
So you'd been involved since 2016, I think you said.
Yes.
Did you or any of your colleagues not consider this ahead of the pandemic, that SCCL might have the need to monitor the inventory of PPE across the system, PPE and other critical supplies, as well as usage? Was that never considered?
Well, yes, in the sense that would it be helpful to know what is stocked and where? Being able to do something about that is the issue, and as I explained a moment ago, putting in inventory management systems is an incredibly expensive
Yes.
undertaking, and not one that we would be able to do. So it relies on each NHS trust making that information
Yes.
available centrally. So would it be a good idea? Incredibly so.
Yes.
Was it something that we were able to influence? Unfortunately, no.
Right. My question was it given thought ahead of time?
Not in the sense of a pandemic, but in the sense of actually running an efficient supply chain, knowing what stock exists throughout that end-to-end supply chain, both downstream and upstream into our customers. Yes, we would regularly feel that the lack of that information was...
Yes. And did you escalate that? Did you feed it up the line to government?
It would have been part of the ongoing discussions.
Okay. And finally, this then, the real problem now, 5 years on from the onset of the pandemic, the real problem now is that the progress that's been made is not sufficient, and that's because of limited funding. Is that a fair
I-
way of putting it?
I think so, yes.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Very grateful, Mr Willoughby. Thank you. Mr Stanton, right the way over there.
Thank you, my lady. My lady, I'll do my best to shorten my questions also. Good afternoon, Mr Webster.
Good afternoon.
I asked questions on behalf of the British Medical Association. My first question relates to the question of communication with healthcare workers. And I'd like to ask you a question. Given that healthcare workers were risking their lives to care for patients, do you believe that there should have been more honesty and candour with frontline healthcare workers about the reality of PPE shortages? For example, healthcare workers were assured that PPE was stockpiled and available to flow into the system, while in fact rationing and demand management was taking place in a number of different forms.
Well, that communication largely in terms of reassurance came from elsewhere within the system. Should we be as honest as possible with healthcare workers in an ideal situation? Absolutely, we should. I think in part it came from, as I said, PPE was such a small fraction of what the NHS uses on any daily basis that there wasn't an expectation that that type of PPE would be needed in the volumes that turned out to be. The PIP stockpile is there for a flu-type pandemic, not the kind of virus that COVID is. But to your question, should there be as much candour as possible? Yes, absolutely.
Did you think then that occurred, that there was in fact candour and honesty? We heard earlier from Dame Emily Lawson that they were desperate. Well, she described the situation as being desperately short of pretty much everything. Do you think healthcare workers on the front line who were taking on very serious risks were aware that the situation was quite as bad as it was?
I can't speak to what they would have known. We wouldn't routinely have a discussion with clinical between us and clinicians. Our discussion would be with procurement managers within a trust, and it's there that we are having the discussions about volumes. We wouldn't expect to then push out further information into healthcare providers.
Thank you, Mr Webster. I'll move on to another question area. This area relates to the extent to which you received clinical input into procurement decisions. I'd like to refer you, please, to a document, INQ 000339268. That's page 40 of that document. If you could let me know when you have it, please.
I do, yeah.
Thank you. If you see the second paragraph of that document, it begins DW, and that's a person, David Wathy, who's elsewhere named in full in this document, advised an area that had arisen is the supply of FFP3 masks, seeing a 3 times surge in demand over the last few weeks in orders coming through NHS SC. The reason for this will be trusts preparing, such as fit testing activity, which will have increased demand. DW advised, if we model that level of demand we've identified for certain product lines in the FFP3, we will be in a position where we would not be able to support BAU, business as usual, demand. As a result of this, we've taken a decision today that we are going to place a restriction on orders that are placed on the NHS SC system to limit these to BAU demand levels. This will be based on the customer's last 12 months BAU demand. The systems will place a ration on this. Daily ordering will be monitored to ensure there is no abnormal ordering. And my question is, would you accept that this is a blunt and bureaucratic response that lacked insight into the clinical and ethical importance of the equipment being restricted?
Well, it's a decision made by the department and not by NHS supply chain.
Yes.
So it would be wrong for me to put into words what they were trying to do here. But in terms of trying to ensure that people have access to as much product as possible, there has to be some limit. If you only have a finite capacity at any given time, you can only give out that many. But as to how they came to that decision, I mean, that would be something the department or David Wathy would have to.
It's rather a strange criterion, isn't it? I mean, business as usual doesn't usually involve too much use of FFR.
No, as we heard this morning, yes.
Whereas when you're fighting a virus of this nature, then it's more likely to be. So business as usual wouldn't help anybody, would it?
As I say, it's probably
Wasn't
something.
your decision, right.
Yeah, but yes.
Sorry for interrupting, Mr. Dutton.
No problem at all, my lady. Mr. Webster, I'll move on to one further document, if I may. If I could have up on screen, please, INQ 000 553817. Again, if you could indicate when you can see that document, that would be helpful. Thank you. This is a witness statement of Rosemary Gallagher on behalf of the Royal College of Nursing. And at paragraph 23A, you should have feedback provided by RCN members on procurement stock that had been procured. And we have one example at 23A, which reads, so far we have had 4 different types of mask from 2 different manufacturers. None have been clinically acceptable. They simply do not fit. I am aware that contracts have already been signed to purchase. When I have fed back to Cabinet Office that they don't fit, I was told any mask was better than nothing. And then over the page 8, 23B, you'll see some further feedback. The clinical engagement is being done after the purchasing decisions have already been made. It is paying lip service to it, and it is too late once decisions have already been made based on tech specs, not clinical specification and evaluations. So my question, Mr. Webster, is, in your experience, was this type of end-user experience missing from the procurement process during the pandemic? And would you have benefited from this type of input?
Well, I think this extract refers to a period when the Cabinet Office was buying the product. So as FFP3 masks, as Dame Emily mentioned this morning, were used in a far smaller number. And at that stage, my understanding is that the testing and the specification didn't involve the sizing element that was clearly, with hindsight, something that would have been beneficial. But at the time, it wasn't. And I think I imagine, and again, I don't have the expertise to speak to this, but I imagine this is one of those things that you learn as time goes on. It would have been helpful to know that in advance. Absolutely, it would. But I think at the time, there wasn't that recognition that the size was going to be the issue that it clearly became later on.
But just thinking in more general terms and looking to the future, do you think the process that was in place at the start of the pandemic was missing this end-user feedback? And is this something that you'd recommend for the future?
I think end-user input into the specification of any product makes sense. Absolutely, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Webster, my final question, which I'll shorten, is a question that was put to Dame Emily Lawson earlier, and I think you indicated you heard her evidence. The question was, why did it take a pandemic for the issues around FFP3 types that would fit a variety of different face types to be recognised during the pandemic? Why wasn't it recognised earlier? You've obviously heard, I think, Dame Emily Lawson's answer. Do you agree with the answer she gave?
I'm not sure I necessarily recall what her answer was.
Her answer was along the lines, FFP3 was quite a specialised piece of equipment. It needed to be used during the pandemic across a much wider range of healthcare worker, and they simply didn't know at that time that the number of different types that would be needed. As somebody who's worked in this area for quite some time, would that be your assessment?
That's certainly my understanding, yes.
And would that be the case even though A particular group that had issues with fit testing were women, and women make up 77% of the healthcare workforce.
If you're asking now, would that still happen, or at the time? So at the time, there wasn't that expectation or recognition that that size and shape was going to be so important, which is why the specification for FFP3s in the PIP stockpile were as they were. If you're saying, as we look forward, would we expect the specification for products going into any new stockpile to reflect the experiences of clinicians of whatever gender or whatever race, then absolutely you would expect that to be a lesson taken away and incorporated into the specifications for the future.
Thank you, Mr. Webster. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Stanton. Those are all the questions we have for you, Mr. Webster. Thank you for the help you've given to the inquiry and for coming along to give evidence today. Thank you.
Thank you.
My lady, our next witness is Julian Kelly.
Thank you, Ms. Riley.
I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Sorry to keep you waiting, Mr.
That's
Kelly.
okay.
Can you state your full name for the record, please?
Julian Kelly.
Thank you very much. You have provided a witness statement to this inquiry. It is INQ 000528585 and it runs to 143 pages and is dated the 23rd of December 2024. Can I just ask you, are the contents of that statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. You have been the Chief Commercial Officer for NHS England and you held that post from April 2019 and you've also acted as its Deputy Chief Executive, is that correct?
No, I've been the Chief Financial Officer, not the Chief Commercial Officer, I think is what you said, since 2019, but I have been the Deputy Chief Executive since July 21.
Thank you. I'm so sorry. Chief Financial
Yeah.
Officer. You, in terms of the rest of your professional experience, you tell us at paragraph 9 of your statement that prior to joining NHS England, you were the Director General Nuclear, and you were also the Director General of Public Spending and Finance at HM Treasury. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And you've held a number of other senior roles, including with the UK Border Agency and also in the private sector. Is that correct?
Yes.
And what were your responsibilities within NHS England during the pandemic?
So largely I was responsible for agreeing the aggregate funding arrangements with government, which were used for funding the NHS, for agreeing and setting some of the rules for commissioners and providers by which they spend that money. And then as needs required, there were specific programmes and projects that I got involved in.
Thank you. In terms of a brief overview of what NHS England did at the time and its responsibilities in relation to procurement generally, NHS England is an executive, non-departmental public body sponsored by DHSE. What does that mean in simple terms?
We are an arm's length body, i.e. a separate organisation with a separate legal identity, where the objectives we are required to meet are set by the department, the funding provided by the department, and we are accountable to the department for seeking to meet those objectives with the money that they give us.
And is it right that NHS England doesn't itself provide services to patients, but it makes sure that they are provided by commissioning services?
Yes.
And this module, as you know, is focused not on services but on key medical equipment and supplies. In normal times, NHS England has a very limited role in relation to physical items that are used in the NHS. Is that right?
Yes, we were not and are not responsible for directly buying the goods and services that, for example, hospital trusts use every day.
That said, during the pandemic, NHS England did carry out some very limited procurement of medical devices and some coveralls and gowns. Is that correct?
Yes, and we bought some pulse oximeters which were distributed to GPs for example, but as you say, in pretty limited circumstances.
In respect of procurement of PPE and other key equipment and supplies, NHS England did, of course, have a role, principally assisting DHSE in setting up and running the parallel supply chain and in liaising with the NHS. Is that a fair summary?
Well, I would summarise it as we provided people and resource to support the department in setting up the PPE cell, and then of liaising with them to communicate to the NHS what was going on and what was expected of the NHS.
In terms of communications with the NHS, I'd like to ask you now about how NHS England sought to engage with the NHS in preparation for the pandemic in January and February 2020, if I may. Can we have up on screen, please, INQ 000409919. So this is a presentation from NHS England and NHS Improvement dated the 1st of February 2020. It summarises what actions NHS England was taking in January and February 2020. Could we go to page 1, please, or page 2? This is effectively a snapshot in time of what was known at this stage. So on the 9th of January, Public Health England, a different organisation, declared an enhanced national incident due to an outbreak of novel coronavirus in China. In terms of your organisation's actions, NHS England and NHS Improvement opened an incident coordination centre on the 22nd of January, and on the 30th of January, NHS England and NHS Improvement declared a level 4 national incident. Briefly, what is the significance of declaring a level 4 national incident?
In simple terms, it means NHS England takes the authority to give stronger direction to NHS providers as to what they should do during that incident. Normally, for example, hospitals are autonomous organisations making their own decisions, but in a level 4 incident, we will take responsibility for giving stronger direction on certain issues.
So does it limit the discretion of NHS trusts in their decision-making, effectively?
Yes, for certain things. I mean, clearly, on a day-to-day basis, you're running an emergency department, you're still responsible for running an emergency department. We're not going to tell you exactly how to do that. But where, for example, we think new capacity needs to be put in place, or there's a particular response, things we want to do to enhance staffing, we will give a stronger instruction.
Can we go to page 6 of this document, please? And also page 5. Thank you. So those two slides are about the assurance work that was being done. Effectively, NHS England was liaising with NHS Trust to ensure that they were ready in the event that they had to deal with the pandemic. We can see there that CCGs were asked to complete assurance assessments of general practices. over the page, we see that there was assurance work being done by multiple NHS organisations to ensure that they were ready. Were the sorts of questions that were being asked by NHS England at this point, did they extend to stock levels of PPE and the ability to comply with any emergency IPC guidance that might be issued?
So as you see from the third bullet, we were asking people what the supplies of their PPE were at that point in time. And we were clearly, I think I'm right, if you were to show one of the other slides, asking people, have you exercised your staff ready for what at the time we were preparing for was a high consequence infectious disease, which has certain protocols that have to be followed. So it was, are people prepared? Have you exercised? Have you briefed your staff? And as I said, we were at least asking people, do you have adequate supplies at that point in time?
And the answer was generally adequate supplies of PPE reported, and that was the answer coming from NHS organisations, was it?
Yes. I mean, clearly, if you were to look at the slides that go further on, there are varied responses between hospitals and, for example, what we thought was going on in GPs.
Yes. And thank you. We can take that document down. In relation to messaging going to NHS trusts regarding PP supply from others, can we have up, please, INQ 000049,357? This clearly carries the Department of Health and Social Care header. It's not an NHS England letter. But this letter is addressed to suppliers to the NHS. And this letter asks suppliers to conduct a full risk assessment of the impact of the pandemic on their supply chains and to consider demand management plans in the event of excessive or unusual ordering patterns. Did NHS England have input into this communication?
I don't know is the simple answer to the question. You would have to ask the department. I mean, I suspect we would have seen it and were aware that it was going out, but I don't know what specific input we had.
All right. Was NHS England aware that this letter was going out to suppliers to the NHS?
As I said, I think we would have seen it. There was a supply chain cell which had been set up between ourselves, the department, PHE and various others at the beginning of January, February. It would not surprise me if this letter was shared before it was sent out.
Thank you. We can take that letter down. So in January and February 2020, NHS England was asking NHS Trusts, very sensibly, of course, to carry out assurance checking to ensure that they had adequate supplies of PPE. In February, the DHSE was encouraging suppliers to monitor ordering patterns, to consider demand management. And we've heard from Mr. Webster speaking on behalf of SECL that the SECL was experiencing a surge in orders. All of those threads taken together, did that put NHS Trusts in a position, do you think, where they were being asked to demonstrate that they were prepared but were struggling to access PPE from the normal sources?
I think right at the start in February and March, you clearly see, as you have just described, trusts concerned about what might be coming down the road and starting to try and increase the level of their local stocks. I mean, at this point, the number of patients actually in hospital are, I mean, I don't know the precise numbers, but they were very, very small. So you can see them preparing the steps that the department, PHE and SCCL agreed to take in the middle of February, which is to begin to put some limits on what orders are fulfilled. is clearly people thinking, how do we just sensibly manage the stock? And the communication that goes from NHS England on the 2nd of March is saying to people, yes, okay, make sure you have enough stock, and certainly for what you can forecast is going to happen over the short term. So I would say 2 to 3 weeks, because it also says anticipate that normal supplies can continue, and there was sort of a 2 to 3 week timetable for those flows, i.e. don't start to create very large stock. So I think that is the communication that is going on, even while the department and PHE are at this point, I think I'm right in saying, agreeing to start to put the PIP stockpile at the disposal of the NHS.
I think the letter you're referring to is the 2nd of March 2020. We do have that. So could we have on the screen, please, INQ 000874445? Is this the letter you had in mind?
That's the letter I had in mind.
Can we go to page 3 of that document, please? These are the bullet points that are giving direction or guidance to NHS and Trust that I think you've just taken us to. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah. So ensure local stock levels are maintained at levels proportionate to anticipated short-term demand, underpinned by regular replenishment from normal supply routes and NHS supply chain. So this letter is effectively asking Trust not to create local stockpiles. Did that need saying because you observed that local stockpiles were being created?
Well, I am, and I wasn't party to this letter at the time, but from having spoken to Keith Willett, who's our National Clinical Incident Director, this is them in coordination with seeing what was going on with the department and PHE, just trying to control the immediate demand so they could manage the flow of stock equitably and maintain sufficient reserves as they looked ahead.
Thank you. We can take that document down. And we know that 8 days later, NHS England's CEO asked the CCO to investigate issues arising from trusts being unable to secure the PPE they needed. So it's a fast-moving picture. We've heard Dame Emily Lawson's evidence of what happened next after NHS England gained a fuller picture of how NHS Trust was struggling to access PPE. So I won't ask you about that. Prior to that, NHS England was also engaging with the status of the stock in the PIP stockpile. Is that right? I'm jumping around in the timeline a little. There were concerns. NHS England had concerns about the stockpile as early as January 2020.
Well, I think at the end of January, it wasn't necessarily that we were concerned, i.e. that we were, and indeed Professor Willett was immediately concerned there wasn't enough in the stockpile. His question was, can I reassure myself that that the stockpile is in reasonable shape? So at that point, and I think it's in one of the documents you had in my EP, we asked for information about what was in the state of the stockpile. So what was in the stockpile at that point in time. He was also asking the question of the department whether they were going to reverse a decision that had been made to start to decommission the EU stockpile, or the stockpile that had been prepared for the potential Brexit disruption, because he was clearly thinking, it's highly uncertain what is going to come. At this point in time, we should preserve, as many of the stocks and supplies that there are.
All right. It's at paragraph 199 of your witness statement that you say that on the 27th of January 2020, in expectation of a pandemic requiring PPE measures, NHS England's National Director for Emergency Planning and Incident Response approached DHSE to discuss concerns regarding the PPE stockpile. Are you saying now that concerns possibly isn't the right word at this stage. NHS England wasn't concerned or worried about the stockpile as such.
Well, I mean, having spoken to Keith, I don't think he was immediately thinking there definitely isn't enough. He is concerned to make sure that he does understand what there is there and that appropriate steps are being taken.
All right, thank you. I'd like to move on to a different topic now, still focusing on work that NHS England did with NHS Trust, but this time I'd like to turn to the Trust Supplier Sourcing Team, the TSS as you refer to it in your statement. Can you tell us briefly what the TSS was?
Yes, and could you just remind me the paragraph in my statement where I raised that?
You might want to turn to paragraph 222, page 48 of your witness statement.
So at the time, there were a lot of leads, offers as to where PPE supplies could be bought. A lot were coming into individual hospital trusts because they were also seeking leads. This was also a point in time where the department was trying to give much stronger coordination of buying as they tried to make sure that people were not, that NHS trusts and the department were not competing with each other. So, and the department and NHS England wanted to make sure individual hospital trusts were properly engaged in that process. So what the decision was to identify a trust and a commercial lead who would take responsibility for coordinating the leads that were coming into trusts across the country for individual commodities, and then to pass those leads on to the national buying team, who at the time, well, throughout the period, are trying to work out which might actually lead to actual stock that can really be bought at scale.
And with the TSS or the lead trusts, were they then effectively triaging and investigating offers of PPE supply?
I think they were largely coordinating all the offers and passing them on to the departmental team. I will admit, I don't know how much triage they were actually doing. If you'd like to know, I'm sure we could follow that up.
I'm sure we can deal with that level of detail with others. And when you say the departmental team, you mean the DHSE, the parallel supply?
Yeah, the PPE cell.
Fine. And we read in your statement also that trusts were collaborating, were sharing excess stocks of their own PPE with others, for example. You've also described at paragraph 258 of your statement that some trusts had hired their own warehouses for PPE and put together local distribution systems. Some used storage systems made available by local resilience forums. Were NHS trusts outside of the work of the TSS, which involves passing on promising leads, were NHS trusts basically creating their own versions of parallel supply chain, mini parallel supply chains?
I wouldn't describe it like that. I would say that in this case, trusts were deciding whether they needed better local storage arrangements from which they could then work out how they distributed the goods that they were then receiving out to their individual sites. So, for example, I know that Manchester Trust, which is a very big trust with lots of sites, did procure a warehouse facility, and I am assuming that is because they thought it was better that they had a bigger single central location from which they could manage, I want to say, the last leg of the distribution to their local sites.
Thank you. I'm going to turn briefly to ventilators. Now, I'm conscious NHS England was not responsible for sourcing or procuring ventilators, but it is right that NHS England was responsible for the allocation of ventilators within England, that is.
Yes.
And NHS England also assisted with the modelling for ventilator need, is that right?
Yes.
You've set out in your statement that the allocation process was based on 3 principles, so that they should be held centrally by NHS England, that they would be distributed as required between hospitals and between regions, is that right?
Yes, I mean, so it's hospitals within regions, yeah.
All right. They were also allocated to devolved nations based on an objective number of ventilators per million population, is that right?
Yes, that would have been decided by the department who is responsible for the coordination across the 4 nations. That would not have been a job of NHS England.
And the prioritisation of where ventilators would be sent at any time, that was based on actual data and patient numbers, is that correct?
Yes.
And the way it worked in practice was that on arrival into the country, if they were new ventilators, that is, that had been bought, they would be transported to a warehouse in the Midlands, and then the military would assist with transport onwards. Is that your
is my understanding.
Was all of this work called the National Ventilation Allocation Programme?
Again, that's my understanding.
All right. NHS England also carried out work in relation to the supply of oxygen. Summarising it in your witness statement, you don't pretend there were no issues around oxygen, but the analysis in your witness statement is that issues around oxygen supply did not relate to the procurement or physical distribution around the country of oxygen. They were to do with the state of the NHS estate and its buildings. Is that
Yes.
right? I have one other topic that I'd like to ask Mr. Kelly about, but is this an appropriate time for a break?
If you'd rather just complete your questions, that's fine. Up to you.
Well, perhaps if we can turn to changes and lessons learnt then at this point. I'll try not to keep you too long, Mr. Kelly, but one of the suggestions within the witness statement that you provide is that there should be the ability to centrally procure when a level 4 emergency is declared. We've talked about the significance of declaring a level 4 emergency, that some discretion is taken away from NHS trusts and NHS England has the ability to provide more direction. Is it envisaged that NHS England would carry out that procurement centrally, or that some other body would do that?
Well, what I think we learnt from the pandemic we have just been through was you needed the capability to surge capacity. I think in an ideal world, we would plan for that capacity to be within one place, building on an existing infrastructure and system. I think the best place for that actually is SCCL, if properly constituted and set up and with a clear requirement upon them to plan for that eventuality. Because it is best if you can surge capacity off an existing system and you are not having to create something from scratch, which was, of course, our experience in the last pandemic, was that we did need to create parallel capacity from scratch.
Part of creating that parallel capacity in the parallel supply chain, of course, was the seconding of staff from various government departments and other bodies to create that new team. In terms of lessons learned, has NHS England made any changes as relate to the surging of staffing, different skill sets around distribution, logistics, modelling, has NHS England done any work in relation to how NHS England, the NHS, SECL might be better prepared to deal with emergency procurement if the need arose again?
So the responsibility both for the stockpile and for thinking about how you prepare for the pandemic actually still remains with the department. SCCL, I think, have done actually quite a lot of work to think about how they could prepare for the future. I think Paul Webster just spoke about some of it, but it includes, and actually the decision by the department to hold on to the extra capacity, warehouse and logistical capacity that was created through the parallel supply chain, now properly integrated as part of SCCL. The work SCCL have done, which again Paul describes just now, which is effectively to, I'm going to say, insource the buying capability that used to be in the towers and is now provided by, for certainly medical consumables, a single team within SCCL who have standard operating procedures, clear training programs. So I think if you were to ask Andrew New, the chief executive, he is more confident that that actually creates the platform from which, if you needed to surge buying capacity, again, you could, even if you are taking staff and resources from other bits of government or from elsewhere. They have thought about how the IT system is set up so you could actually put new customers on it faster than was possible. They have held on to some of the IT systems you would need to put in place if you actually want to track what is coming out of the factory door in China all the way to the port in the UK. They have a new logistics supplier contract which aims to embed that more fundamentally in the way they work. And I think, as Paul also was describing, we, with them, have been investing in some of the inventory management systems you would want in individual hospital trusts. And now we're doing that because actually we think there's an economic case to do it today. But it would have the added advantage that you would then have kind of more real-time visibility of what is going on in individual hospitals. And we, the NHS England, have invested in a data platform, which, again, I think it was Emily was describing this morning, makes it much easier to connect a wide variety of systems across the NHS so you can pull all of that information very easily and rapidly together in one place.
And is there anything beyond what you have just outlined that, reflecting on your experience in NHS England during the pandemic, you would recommend so that NHS England and SCCL are better prepared for a future pandemic?
I mean, actually, the decision that has already been made to have a bigger stockpile and the work, I think, that is underway to think about what are the different things you might need with different sorts of pandemics. I mean, I am not the expert in that field, but just to test the thinking of, what are the sorts of things one might need and where might it be appropriate to hold things in stock versus you need to have a plan to surge the ability to access other goods. That clearly is a bit of work that needs to continue to be done. I would say we should make SCCL or whoever, if they are going to be, I'm going to call it the provider of last resort, like the platform upon which you would surge capacity. I think they should be a formal part of pandemic exercises in the future, because you really want to exercise your actual physical ability to change, your practice from business as usual into emergency or crisis situations.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
We've got about 10 to 15 minutes more of questions, Mr. Kelly, and we usually take a break for everyone's benefit, but particularly stenographer. Are you okay if we take the break now, or would you rather get the question done so you can get it?
I really don't mind, whatever's easiest.
Sure.
Yeah.
In which case, I think we'll take the break now, and I shall return at 20 past.
All right.
Mr Weatherby.
Mr Kelly, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK group. Can I start with the adequacy of PPE stocks? So you've already been taken to the report of the 1st of February, which included the assessment of generally adequate supplies of PPE. And you've told us that that was based on asking trusts to undertake an assurance process, and that rather than any kind of detailed look at actual supplies or forecasted demand, yes?
I don't believe it was based on a forecasted demand for, let's say, the kind of reasonable worst-case scenarios that subsequently emerged.
Yeah. So you refer certainly in your statement to just undertaking an assurance process. On the next day, the 2nd of February, in your witness statement of paragraph 201, you refer to an email that was received and dealt with by Mr. Willett, Keith Willett, that you referred to, and I wonder whether we could have that up. It's INQ 000409918. And this is from a clinical director in Alder Hey, Simon Kenny, to Mr. Keith Willett that you referred to. And I'm going to just start at the bottom and work up. And it's, hi Keith, I know you're really busy, but Redacted is an intensivist in the Northwest, and it sounds as though stock levels of PPE are very low and resistance to buying more on grounds of costs. Not sure if there has been messaging to trusts from NHSE on this. And so it goes on. And Mr. Willett's replies above that, Simon, stock levels are not low in the NHS supply chain. I literally have millions of sets. I have the EU exit stockpile too, exclamation marks. And then he refers to costs. And Mr. Kenny replies, very helpful. So you refer to that in your witness statement, and you say in your witness statement that, in fact, despite that reassurance that's given, it was then escalated up to DHSC. Given that NHS England didn't have detailed knowledge of the stockpiles, and it had raised these concerns with DHSC, and it didn't have any model for the demand to come, or inventory data, and was aware of these reports, okay, anecdotal reports, but reports nevertheless, which it took seriously. Do you think that, would it be right that there wasn't really a robust evidential basis for the reassurance that was given by Mr. Willits in that email, or indeed in the 1st of February report?
So at this point in time, I don't think Keith's reassurance to Simon is wrong. Simon's email, I think, is dealing with, actually, when you look at it, a very specific issue, which is, I mean, really straightforwardly, a trust coming to the end of the financial year, trying to make sure it's balancing its books. And at this point in time, so, you know, before I think people have really necessarily appreciated everything that will come, it sounds like there's a bit of an instruction to kind of control the budget on very local grounds. But Keith, I think, has at least an awareness. I can't quite remember when he has shown the sort of update on the PIP stockpile and the stocks, which is also in my bundles. Sure. So he knows there are, as he says, literally millions of of sets. So at this point, it's not a supply issue. I think it is a specific local issue.
Point taken about the email, but I put it in the context of the 1st of February general reassurance. Do you not think that that NHS England should have been more transparent about the position it was in at that point, particularly now with the benefit of hindsight, what we know happened?
Well, I think
that just let me finish the question.
My apologies.
It simply didn't have sufficient data to determine whether there was adequate supplies for the purpose that on the 1st of February it was reporting, i.e. where we were in terms of the onset of the pandemic.
So if I can separate two things, which is the exercise that Keith had instigated to ask NHS providers and commissioners whether they were prepared and preparing for an incident, which includes a whole series of questions, one of which is, can you check that your stocks of PPE are adequate at that point in time? And then two, the question is, looking ahead, what might be about to happen, and his question to the department who are responsible for the PIP stockpile, which is, can you provide me with some, Keith asking them, can you just provide
Yes.
reassurance about the state of the PIP stockpile? So I think it is fair that Keith and his team get back the set of reassurances they do from the, if I call it the awareness raising and preparing, the preparation exercise they instigated. But that is different from Keith looking ahead and asking, okay, can you tell me what the state of the PIP stockpile is, and the work that's commissioned at the same time, which NHSE with PHE agreed to do, which is start to kind of do some reasonable worst case scenario modelling, and the actions that are being taken by the department in parallel, which include around the end of that first week in February, asking SCCL to increase their buying.
Yes, okay. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to talk across you or cut you short, but time is very short. So it may well be that at the 1st of February, for the 1st of February's purposes, there were generally adequate supplies. But going forward, and the purpose of the 1st of February report, it should have made clear that whereas we may have adequate supplies as on the 1st of February, we're certainly not going to have adequate supplies on the 1st of March or the 1st of April. That's the message that should have been given, isn't it?
Well, no, because I just want to, again, separate the two exercises. There is an exercise which is reporting what have we just had fed back from NHS providers and commissioners at the end of January. And there's a separate exercise which is looking ahead, and as I said, includes NHSE and PHE agreeing to do some sort of reasonable worst case scenario modelling to say, okay, but if we look ahead over a course of 3, 4, or 5 months, what might the demand be? And what do we think is the state of the stockpile relative to that demand? And I would just say the slides which say general reassurance are for just reporting back a specific exercise, and that is separate from the work that gets commissioned out of the supply chain cell to say, okay, what do the stocks look like and what do we think about the future?
Okay, well, I'm going to move on from that, but finally on the same point, when NHS England did create national and regional projections of demand in February and March, and I'm referring to your paragraph 219, those projections only considered direct COVID care in the acute care sector, and they then failed to capture the level of demand across primary care, ambulances and other healthcare settings. Why was that?
So at that point in time, we are probably focused on the demand that is going to be experienced in hospitals. We were still preparing, I think, at that point in time for dealing with a high consequential infectious disease that has quite a specific protocol within GP settings. Again, I'm not the expert, but you would have seen probably much lower levels of kind of PPE demand. So the focus is on where we are expecting to see the vast bulk of the demand within the NHS.
Let me move on. Oxygen. You've told us through your statement that NHS England weren't aware of any procurement issues that arose in relation to the supply of oxygen, as opposed to the infrastructure, which I'll come on to in a moment. In Module 3, the inquiry heard from Dr. Crisp from NICE, who gave evidence about NHS England guidance on the 9th of April, referring to the reduction of required levels of oxygen saturation. So for the most acutely ill patients, 94 to 98% saturation, and the new guidance said that it was reasonable to go down to 90 to 94% because of supply problems with oxygen. Were you aware of that?
So, as I explain in my witness statement, the issue was not per se the supply of liquid oxygen to hospitals. It was the confidence and ability to flow that in sufficient volume to enough beds if we saw, or when indeed we saw, very high levels
Right.
of demand for oxygen therapy.
So infrastructure.
And that was to do with the state of the infrastructure,
Okay.
the pipes, and I apologise, I'm about to use words I even barely understand, but the evaporators and various others of the
Okay.
mechanisms.
The actual legend by the guidance from Dr. Crisp has put into evidence suggests the guidance was lowering O2 saturation in response to limited supply. Not infrastructure, but limited supply.
But it's the supply to the bed. So it isn't that there isn't like a sufficient tank with enough liquid oxygen sort of on the hospital site. It's the ability to flow it to the number of beds. So it's literally taking it from the tank through the pipes to the beds, and it's the ability to flow enough of it to enough patients. So it's the supply issue to the bed rather than the kind of aggregate volume of liquid oxygen that is available
Yes.
to the hospital.
In terms, final point, in terms of infrastructure, you have described in your statement what you've just touched upon at paragraphs 321 to 325. And you state that NHS England has mandatory guidance in place to ensure the infrastructure is adequate. But that is monitored by, although it's mandatory, it's monitored by self-reporting. Do you agree that the pandemic revealed that the self-certification process or requirement was inadequate, as many hospitals didn't meet the mandatory guidance?
Well, it certainly revealed that where trusts had maintained good governance and maintained some of the expertise, they were the trusts that tended not to have problems.
Yes.
And those who had not maintained some of that governance is where we saw some of the problems emerge. It is always a question as to how many things you are trying to sort of monitor nationally.
Okay.
And
I
what is
understand
the
that.
responsibility of individual boards within hospitals who are responsible for the safe operation
Okay.
of those hospitals?
Can I take it that that's a yes?
Well, there were certainly issues.
And do you agree that plans for preparedness in the future must ensure that that self-certification process is changed so that it doesn't lead to the same problem in the future?
I would say it is a question that boards need to ask themselves, which is, are they maintaining the sort of right standards within the estate? And as I also flagged, I think in part of the lessons learned in my report, one of the issues is going to be, are we able to invest enough in sort of the critical infrastructure risk within the estate to maintain?
Okay, so can we take that as a yes as well?
Quality. Well, certainly yes, we need to
Thank you.
maintain the quality of the estate.
Thank you, Mr. Weatherby. Mr. Thomas is over there.
Mr. Kelly, I'm representing FEMHO, the Federation of Ethnic Minority Healthcare Workers. Mr. Kelly, at paragraph 242 of your witness statement, you note concerns with the FFP3 masks not fitting Black, Asian or minority ethnic staff adequately, often due to facial hair or for religious reasons. My question is this: what steps were taken to address these fit issues, and was there consideration or procurement of alternative types of respiratory protective equipment to better meet the needs of these particular groups?
I don't have a lot to add to what Dame Emily Lawson said this morning, which was actually at the beginning of the pandemic, as I understand it, I was not involved, it was not an NHS England decision. There was a decision by PHE to procure, I think, a few thousand powered hoods to provide some alternative to the use of FFP3 masks. And as these issues began to be raised in May, there was clearly consideration to did a broader range, was there a broader range of masks that were available on the market? I think that did become part of, as things became available, part of the approach of the PPE cell, as well as the work that was done by the Deputy Chief Nursing Officer to understand what was really driving this. How could we improve the training and resources available to individual trusts in how to do fit testing to make sure those things were being done appropriately, as well as a reminder to boards and the leadership of NHS trusts of their responsibilities to make sure that staff had been appropriately fit tested.
Sorry, Mr. Kelly, can I just cut through this? The reality is, this was not thought of as an issue, despite it being absolutely clear that one size would not fit all. That's reality, isn't it?
I don't think that's the case. I think in advance of the pandemic and when the requirement was set for the PIP stockpile, people had thought that you would need a variety. I think issues emerged in May and the teams responsible took action to try and address the issues that emerged in May, as you were discussing with Dame Emily this morning.
Sorry, I don't understand, and perhaps it's just me. If this was an issue that you and your team were aware of beforehand, why is it that such a disproportionate number, particularly of the groups that I represent, had problems with fitting of these of this equipment? Because it's not making sense to me. Perhaps you can help.
So it was not my team that was responsible for what was in the stockpile before the pandemic, though I understand consideration was given to what was the kind of variety of masks that you would need for different groups of people. It is why there is such an effort, as described this morning and by others, to seek to, buy stock through the pandemic. And as issues emerged in May, or where there were problems, it is why the teams took action to respond to what was going on the ground. And clearly it's why lessons being learnt now, which is the work to enable the electronic staff records to record what the preference is for individual members of staff, to look at how you can keep a rolling programme of testing staff, as well as the research that is going on or planned to look at what alternatives there are.
Let's look to the future. It's crucial that NHS England learns from the experiences of the pandemic to improve its procurement processes. I'm sure you'll agree with that, yes?
Well, yes, NHS England, yes, what we have learned that I discussed earlier with the supply chain, and yes, for the responsibilities that the department and others still hold.
Right. So the development and implementation of a fit testing algorithm indicates a move towards addressing some of the challenges faced during the pandemic. However, ensuring that these improvements are sustained and that inclusivity remains a core consideration in the procurement strategies, you would agree that's essential for future preparedness. So at paragraphs 248 and 249 of your witness statement, the publication of a fit testing algorithm and processes by NHS England, looking forward, help us with this. What long-term reforms are planned to ensure that inclusivity is fundamentally integrated into the procurement processes, particularly concerning the needs of ethnic minority healthcare workers?
So the things I just said, which is the lessons from the pandemic to make sure the stockpile that we now have or is planned for the future has as broad a range of relevant masks as are necessary, the work that's already been done to automate the electronic staff record so it is possible to actually log individual staff preferences, the work I just spoke about, which is how do you sort of have a rolling program of fit testing and training the trainers, and the research that I cannot remember if it is planned or already underway to look at what alternatives are there for individuals where an FFP3 mask might never work. For example, the use of powered hoods and other bits of equipment.
Thank you, Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Mr.
Millie.
Thomas. Those are all the questions that we have for you, Mr. Kelly. As I said today, Emily, I do understand that this is a difficult week for you, so thank you very much for taking the time to come and help us and for your written statement.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Was you done that in your right hand, please?
Order?
Yes, please. And repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
Could you pause, please? Sorry.
I
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth.
Thank you, please.
Sorry you've been kept waiting for so long, Mr. Brace.
Not a
Your
problem.
last witness, but certainly not the least. Today.
Could you state your full name, please?
Yeah, Alan Brace.
Thank you. You have provided the inquiry with a witness statement dated the 9th of December 2024, and it is INQ 000527571. Can I ask you, are the contents of that witness statement true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes, they are.
Thank you. You were the Director of Finance for the Health and Social Services Group in Welsh Government during the pandemic, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And prior to that, you have held a number of senior leadership roles within the NHS in Wales and
Yes.
also within Welsh Government. So I'd like to really focus on the work that you did during the pandemic. And you were, in fact, asked to chair the PP sourcing and distribution group between June and September 2020, were you not?
Yeah, I was approached around about the 23rd of March by Dr. Andrew Goodall, who was Director General. Basically, there were growing concerns around PP at the Welsh Government, NHS social care ministerial level. So Andrew asked me to take a leadership role on behalf of himself, really, and to focus on the sourcing of PPE, any storage issues, but also distribution. At that time, there were two main challenges: buying replacement product and distributing the product that we had.
And were you doing this as well as shouldering your responsibilities for finance for the NHS in Wales?
Yeah, I kept on with all of my responsibilities as Director of Finance and got involved in things like the field hospitals, taking over private hospitals. So there was a fairly significant component to the other part of my job.
And you reported to the Director General of the Health and Social Services Group, or Chief Executive of NHS in Wales. So that would have been Dr. Andrew Goodall at the time, is that right?
That's correct.
You've described your role during the pandemic as providing a bridge between Welsh Government and the NHS in Wales to ensure coordination and communication across Welsh Government. On a day-to-day basis, what did that look like?
There was probably two phases for me for the time I was involved in the in PPE particularly. The first phase was probably March, April and May, which was really all about stabilising the position we found ourselves in, both on the distribution front to health and social care, but also on the replenishment front around how we would replenish the stock that was quickly depleting. And I didn't really have any time or inclination really to set up any new groups then. I was outside the planning and response structure. There was a countermeasures group who was involved in the release of the PIP stockpile. So my focus in that period was just to stabilise both the distribution and the replenishment. As that became more stable, I then established two main groups. The sourcing and distribution group, which was to not just keep things stable, to start to build resilience and to think about planning ahead, particularly for the winter. I also set up a policy and modelling group to start to have a look ahead around any changes to guidance and what that could look like in relation to volumes. I was also running for a lot of that period a weekly meeting with the PP leads from every health board in Wales, and sitting alongside that I also had a weekly meeting with the directors of finance for the NHS in Wales, who in Wales are also directors of procurement. So there was a crossover on some issues, I think, where I needed perhaps more sort of involvement with a procurement hat on. I used that sort of structure as well.
Thank you. I'd like to turn to the relationship between the NHS in Wales, the Health and Social Services Group and NWSSP. NWSSP is the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership, is that right?
That's correct.
And it is the organisation that procures goods and services for use across the NHS in Wales.
Yeah, it also is responsible for storage and distribution of goods as well. So it's a sourcing, storage and distribution organisation for the NHS in Wales.
And is it correct that NWSSP provided almost all of the medical consumables needed within the NHS in Wales on a day-to-day basis?
Yes, that was the basis of the shared service.
Health boards and trusts occasionally bought from other sources. They were free to do so, is that right?
It was probably very limited. Each of the local health boards would also have a small procurement team that was also employed by the shared service. So they were literally outposted in LHBs and trusts, and if they felt that there was probably more of a need for a local procurement, they would handle that on behalf of shared services, but within the NHS bodies.
And broadly speaking, prior to the pandemic, NWSSP's remit did not include provision to social care or to GPs, dentists, pharmacies, community healthcare providers. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yes. And how would you describe the relationship between NWSSP and the Health and Social Services Group or Welsh Government organisationally?
Organisationally, very close. There were certain elements that Welsh Government also had a relationship with shared services on, particularly expert advice on capital building programmes and development, and also there was an SLA in place for the PIP stock that Welsh Government was responsible for.
Sorry to stop you there. SLA, Service Level Agreement.
Oh, Service Level
Right.
Agreement, sorry.
Right. Yes, do carry on.
Yeah, so generally most of the relationship was between shared service and the local health boards and the NHS trusts. There was a committee. Welsh Government were represented on that committee. My deputy sat on that committee, which really just picked up any issues that were relevant for the Health and Social Services group and a coordination and information exchange function.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to the Welsh share of the PIP stockpile, if I may. You tell us in your statement that the Wales share of the UK health countermeasures stockpile was 4.78% based on the Barnett formula, and the administration of the stockpile was delegated to NWSSP, as you've just told us, through an SLA. Was NWSSP ultimately responsible for the storage and then onwards distribution of the stock in the PIP stockpile?
Yes, I think the plans that were in place, there was a countermeasures group put in place to oversee the release of the PIP stockpile to the NHS.
And did the Health and Social Services Group or Welsh Government more broadly ever monitor the stockpile prior to the arrival of the pandemic to ensure that it was fit for purpose?
That would have been the responsibility of NWSPP, unless there were any issues that they needed a different decision made by Welsh Government, basically.
Can we please display INQ 000298983? This is a ministerial advice provided to Vaughan Gething, who was in post as Minister for Health and Social Services at this point. And this ministerial advice asks him to agree to the release of the Welsh share of the PIP stockpile. Could we turn to page 3 of that document, please? There's a summary of there's a summary of what actions are taken by other nations, and then we come to Wales in the middle of the page. Has a COVID-19 health countermeasures group in place, chaired by the Health Emergency Planning Advisor, as you've just outlined to us, and includes key officials from Shared Services Procurement. Is that NWSSP, Shared Services Procurement? Effectively, through this structure, NWSSP is in the process of making up distribution boxes of PPE for GP sites across Wales, and we have there a breakdown of what is going to be distributed to GP surgeries in Wales. So this is principally at this point in March, 6th of March 2020, a request that NWSSP be permitted to push out supplies of PPE to GP surgeries. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. We can take that down. Vaughan Gething has been frank with the inquiry in his witness statement regarding the stockpile itself. Can we have up INQ 000536418? Thank you. Paragraph 104 of his witness statement, he tells us he encountered issues regarding distribution from the stockpile. The pandemic influenza stockpile of PP was crucial during the first 4 months of the COVID-19 response, but key issues for us were how quickly the PP pandemic stockpile would be used up, how rapidly supply chains would fail, and frankly, that a small amount of our stockpile was not fit for purpose. However, having the stockpile in place did buy time for the NHS Wales Shared Services Partnership to successfully secure ongoing PP supplies from other sources. Thank you. Were you aware that there was, as he puts it, a small amount of the stockpile that was not fit for purpose?
Not at the time I got involved in PP, but in one of the meetings, I believe it was probably one of the trade union discussions, an issue was raised around respirator masks, what they call the FFP3, where a question was raised about out-of-date stock. And Mr. Mark Roscoe from Shared Services responded to say that there was out-of-date stock that had been retested. Some of it redated, but given the pressure on the stockpile, some of it was sent out, having been tested, but with the dates were out of date. And that was the only real issue that I personally got, picked up around the issues with the stock. The bigger issues for me was the speed that they went out and the basis that they were going out with. As I described earlier, Shared Services not only procured for the NHS, but they stored and distributed. And that was very much a pull system where the NHS would ask for stock and it would go to the delivery point who had requested the stock. The countermeasures was very much about a push system, and that created quite a bit of confusion, I think, initially in the NHS and obviously subsequently in social care.
All right, we'll come to that shortly. But just return to the issue of the FFP3 respirators. Were you aware that, in fact, the Welsh share of FFP3 masks within the stockpile had expired of that product, FFP3?
What I understood at the time was that stock had expired, had been retested for suitability, redated, but not all of the stock had been redated, and that was the only sort of dealings that I had with about that issue with the PIP stockpile.
All right. The NWSSP remit was widened, it was expanded to encompass the social care sector, and that decision was made on the 19th of March 2020. Is that right?
That's correct, yeah.
And so that dramatically increased the NWSSP customer base effectively and distribution targets, didn't it?
Yeah, it sort of brought two challenges, really. One was greater pressure to replenish the stock, and the second challenge was not an established distribution network that had to be sort of agreed quite quickly with the local authorities in Wales.
By the 7th of May 2020, around 2/3 of the social care sector's needs were being met by NWSSP. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
In other words, the care sector was still making its own arrangements to secure 1/3 of the PPE that it was using day to day?
Yes, I understand that even after that date, there were still ongoing procurement buy-in by parts of the social care system in Wales.
And so local authorities largely were having to carry out procurement of PPE in relation to that PPE, to that 1/3 that was not supplied by NWSSP, is that right?
Yes.
And during that period, would you accept there was an element of competition over the same types of items? NWSSP was trying to source PPE, local authorities and the care sector were trying to source PPE. They were both after the same things, essentially.
Probably not to any great extent. I don't think the local authorities, as I understand it, it was some of the elements of the social care system that was within the private sector had made their own arrangements, but I don't believe it was the local authorities didn't collectively purchase PPE. They had spread their procurement expertise quite thinly amongst the 22 local authorities, so there was no central capacity or capability to do very much in relation to PPE, so that's why the shared service actually took over social care.
And it wasn't until October 2020 that NWSSP formally confirmed it was going to be able to supply most of the PP needs of the social care sector. Is that right?
It was a lot sooner than that. I think the formal SLA was probably signed later in the year, but I think from the 19th of March, when social care came under the shared service, the objective was to supply all of social care needs from the one source. I think there was a slight delay around the formal service level agreement, but that was just more of an administrative issue rather than anything to do with any delay in shared service trying to cover all of social care.
So the service level agreement was in place by October 2020. When do you say, in fact, NWSSP was supplying most of the needs, the PP needs of the social care sector?
From memory, I think we felt a lot more confident and assured around the NHS by the end of April, beginning of May. I think we probably felt a little bit more confident and assured for social care through sort of June and July. I think it was probably during that period we started to feel that with the volumes that we were sourcing, with building resilience into our stock, that we felt a little bit more confident and assured. There were individual items which remained a constant challenge, but I think generally through that summer we felt more confident, and we started to turn our attention to the winter plan then to make sure that we had enough stock to get us through what felt like it was going to be a difficult winter.
Right. When you say you felt more confident and assured, at what stage would you say the social care sector was having the majority of its PPE in fact supplied by NWSSP?
I certainly believe through the summer we had put that on for those who needed it supplied by shared services. I think we were then supplying, I believe, from my understanding.
And why was there such a delay between the announcement on the 19th of March and the signing of the SLA in October?
I think at the time I was pretty much sort of working on my own at a Welsh Government level with colleagues around me. Shared service was a smallish team actually focused on, sourcing material, distributing material. There was no issue between local authorities and shared service or Welsh Government on the need to put it on a formal footing. The thing that really sort of probably held it up was more in the modelling and the data. I think local authorities took quite a while to have an agreed methodology across 22 local authorities that could feed into a service level agreement that would form a more formal basis of the type of volumes that were both needed and also required to be sourced. So it was more in the modelling and the data side rather than in any intent or any disagreement on shared service continuing in the role. I think as the decision was made in the 19th of March, all of us just really focused on dealing with health and social care as one and the same thing.
You talked about modelling and data. Perhaps we'll turn to that now. You've addressed the social care sector. Is it right that there were also real difficulties in getting a clear picture of existing stocks within the NHS estate in Wales, stocks held by individual health boards or indeed hospitals, and indeed their usage rates? That was a challenge that you faced at the outset of the pandemic, is that right?
I think that certainly was the situation in the last part of March and up until the beginning of April, when we had asked the military to go in and assess what the issues were, and they produced a report on the 2nd of April that was exceptionally helpful in highlighting the things that we needed to quickly put right. So I think from the NHS side of things, We certainly had sort of got into a better position early April, and because shared services are traditionally distributed and stored items, you know, the systems weren't ideal, but we had a lot more data and a lot more intelligence and insight into the NHS. We, I guess, collectively had to sort of try and create that as quickly as we could within social care.
I think we have the report that you're referring to, dated 2nd of April 2020. Can we have up on screen, please, INQ 000299126? I'm very grateful indeed. So this is a report produced by the military, having conducted a review into the distribution and logistics arrangements in place for PPE. Was this done at your request?
Yes, when I took up the role in PPE, as I said, there were sort of two main challenges. Could the UK government replenish stock? But the other one was what I probably would say is a disconnect between shared services believing that they had pushed out enough stock to the NHS. And before I guess I got involved, a lot of issues being raised by the NHS, particularly with Dr. Andrew Goodall, I guess, saying that there was real concerns around the availability. So there was a slight disagreement, I guess, or a disconnect between what shared service believed was out in the NHS and what the NHS believed they had. And we didn't really have any significant capacity or capability to spend a lot of time on this. So the military seemed to be an obvious choice to quickly try and understand what the issues were. And I guess they confirmed that there was enough stock out there. They didn't encounter any of the hospitals without stock. But because I guess they were pushing the product out, there clearly was coordination issues at the hospital end about what stock was held where and how to sort of distribute that as quickly as possible across the various sites and hospitals within the hospital.
I'm so sorry. Can we go to pages 3 and 4 of that document, please? Can we go to page 3 first? At paragraph 11, the assessment is that NHS Wales PPE distribution system has sufficient capacity to meet current demand. So there was capacity, as you say, and resilience to meet the likely increased demand, but there are certain pinch points, examples are given. However, at current usage rates, NHS Wales SSP only have 4 weeks of supply of PPE in storage with no clear idea of where and how this supply will be replenished. So there may have been PPE within actual hospital buildings or care settings, but the reality is at this point, there was the prospect of only having 4 weeks supply in storage. Is that right?
Yeah, that was when I got involved. I was concerned about distribution, but by far my biggest concern was getting clarity and assurance from the UK government that they could fulfil their obligations under the emergency plan. And that proved exceptionally difficult. So I think at the 2nd of April, I was really spending quite a lot of time there trying to get clarity and assurance from Department of Health in England around can they meet the needs, because the stock was diminishing more rapidly than we had anticipated. And we really wanted to know were they able to fulfill their obligations or not. So yeah, that statement was true. I think there was no assurance that stock, there was no guaranteed dates or no guaranteed volumes about when we could expect stock to arrive. And procurement was the response. The plan for the PIP stock was the responsibility of UK government.
We can take that down now. Thank you very much. Can we just turn quickly then to you had a role in liaising with the UK government regarding PPE, is that right?
Sorry, Victoria, I missed that last bit.
I'll speak up. You did personally carry out some work liaising with UK government regarding PPE. Wales also took part in mutual aid arrangements between the four nations of the UK, is that right?
Yeah, yes, that's right.
Can you describe in brief terms what you think are the most important lessons learned from that work that you did liaising with the UK central government regarding PP, both the stockpile and then PP that was procured, and mutual aid arrangements and the sharing of PPE between nations?
Yeah, on the first point, it was fairly obvious, you know, and we probably were a very small, coordinated, tight team with a very centralised approach in Wales. I think Scotland and Northern Ireland were probably the same. England was quite fragmented and disjointed. You had trusts procuring, supply chain, you had NHS England, you had the Department of Health, so it was really difficult to be able to sort of talk to anybody and get that sort of confidence, clarity and assurance about what was going to get procured and when could we expect it. And that never really, in that first phase, we never got to a stage where we could get any confidence or assurance. So we quickly made the decision that we would have to start sourcing ourselves. There was no other option. The stock was going too quickly, and we needed to sort of make sure the front line was protected in health and social care.
And is that why NWSSP was then tasked to take that on?
Yes, absolutely. The mutual aid question, I guess, is slightly different. So there was a very good, I guess, understanding, cooperation around the need for mutual aid. The First Minister and the Minister of Health, Vaughan Gething, was hugely supportive of helping any other country that we could. And we did put formal arrangements to start sharing data, intelligence, and where we could help. And we probably had stronger relationships through procurement networks with Northern Ireland and Scotland. But the approach to mutual aid, once we got it on a better footing, was actually very positive and helpful. And we had some help from other countries, and we actually were a net helper. We managed to particularly give England quite substantial amounts as a result of our sort of sourcing activities.
You say you're a net helper. Wales provided more items of PPE by way of mutual aid than it received from others, didn't it?
Yes.
Reflecting on your experiences in the pandemic, what would your lessons learned be if you were to give advice as to how Wales could be better prepared, not only for the procurement of PPE, but you've alluded to real issues around distribution, how Wales could be better prepared for both of those challenges in the future?
Yeah, I think the Wales Audit Office report, I'd fully agree with their insight and their recommendations. They're very helpful recommendations for the future, so I won't sort of repeat those. And there's certainly improvements need to be made in planning. But I've always believed that plans are great, but it's people that make plans work. And we were really fortunate in Wales to have some very experienced procurement professionals sitting within an organisation that had central responsibility for buying, storing, distributing, and fairly sort of joined up, established relationships. And I think they were critical, particularly in that early phase of the pandemic. The other thing which I think is really important, and particularly for Wales, is something that I call small country governance. One of the things that really helped was, rather than adding to groups that were probably too many and often conflicting, the ability to get key people together really quickly, get a really good handle on a problem, and then put in place actions really quickly. And for that to sort of go quickly through structures, even up to the minister, to get approval for something was actually quite fundamental and important, I think, in our ability. And it's hard to capture that, I think, in the usual formal approach to emergency planning, because most people would say, well, what does that look like as a plan? And I think probably if Wales, we could probably put a lot more attention on sort of trying to capture that in a slightly different way. And then my last point, which I think remained a worry for me, is the collapse of global. We had understood that just-in-time global supply chains, probably for cost reasons, was the way to do things. And when they collapsed, we had no resilience in our supply chain. And I still worry for future pandemics how we build resilience, because resilience comes at a cost. And ideally, the most resilient approach is UK manufacturing that we could probably rely on. But we're probably not big enough to manufacture all our PPE needs. And there would be, need to be an understanding that at times, public money would have to be used to write stock off and to replenish stock that was out of date. And that's always a challenge, I think, when there's competing demands for public money. The more you spend on pandemic responses, the more resilient you probably are, particularly that supply chain and how you deal with sort of sourcing. But it's a difficult juggling act. So I think a debate around what does resilience really look like then, given the lessons that we learned from this and given the lessons of PPE, I think will be critical.
There was an attempt in Wales to stimulate domestic manufacture of PPE.
Yeah.
I wonder whether you're able to tell us how much of that capacity has been retained post-pandemic.
I wouldn't know. I mean, I retired in June 21, so I wasn't around for how much was sort of kept on. I mean, I know for certain, the Royal Mint made visors. I think that just stopped. That was just something to support the pandemic. And whereas that was critical, it was never a huge part of meeting the demands and the needs that was generated by the thing. But I think I understand some aspects of it continued, but I think some was definitely more of a call to arms for companies to help produce, but with a clear idea that they would stop at the end.
And then in terms of recommendations going forward, would you agree that the care sector in Wales should be part of distribution plans for PPE from the outset?
Oh, yes, absolutely. I think one of the issues with local authorities is that there are 22 local authorities in Wales, which means procurement expertise is often spread very thin. I think when the pandemic hit, they started to create groups outside the main planning thing, which I don't think helped, and their more natural route was through to the Welsh Government procurement team, which weren't really doing anything on procurement at all, but equally they had no central storage or distribution capability. And I just think it would make entire sense that for business as usual, social care is dealt with by the shared service. I think for emergency planning and pandemic response, that just it's a scaling up of business as usual rather than trying to create things from new, which I think the lessons from the pandemic are never do that. Trying to create organisational type models, groups, can often add to the problem, not help.
Thank you, my lady. Those are all my questions.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr Wetherby has a couple of questions for you.
Very briefly indeed. Mr Brace. I ask questions on behalf of COVID-bereaved Families for Justice UK. Firstly, you note at paragraph 47 of your statement that the first meeting of the COVID-19 Planning and Resource Group was held on the 20th of February 2020. Given that it was a strategic group and looking at the state of preparedness, are you able to help us as to why it wasn't, in fact, stood up before 20th of February?
The planning and response structure that was put in place in February was much more of a government service joined up structure. So there was, the NHS were represented on it. There was a subgroup of Welsh Local Government Association, Directors of Social Services, and Welsh Government officials. So it was very much to quickly connect up what was happening at a government level with what was happening operationally. So it was, I think, much more than a strategic. It was
Yes.
much more of a practical. What are the problems? How do we deal with them?
Yeah.
Structure. And I'm not sure. I never sat in that structure
Right.
actually in my roles.
Okay, would you agree that it might have been preferable had it been set up earlier, given its role?
Certainly for all aspects of the pandemic,
Sure.
speed was important.
Now, my other point, I was going to pick up the point that you'd made already, that the NHS Wales shared service partnership was expanded to procure and supply PPE for social care settings only on the 19th of March. And I was going to ask you whether you would agree that it should have been set up earlier, but I think you've probably answered that by saying that you think it should do so as business as usual.
Yeah, I think the only additional point I would make is that when you look at the countermeasures group and the social care subgroup, PPE was getting flagged earlier than that, and I think around the 9th of March, the countermeasures group actually advised the Minister that where possible, the local health boards should help out social care because they seem to be having emerging difficulties.
Right, but going forward, your recommendation is it should simply be dealt with as throughout business as usual, never mind in an emergency.
Yes, and you've got a much stronger foundation then to deal with both health and social care collectively.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr Weatherby. Ms Parsons, who's over that way.
Bruce?
It's a little bit quiet, but that may be because I'm
No, it was
probably
quiet for
slightly
me
deaf.
Try again.
Is that better?
That's much better.
Good afternoon, Mr Brace. I ask questions on behalf of the COVID-19 bereaved families for Justice Cymru. Just one, possibly two topics. Firstly, please, modelling and distribution of PPE. You say in your statement that with the help of modelling, by late April 2020, you achieved, and I quote, a clear burn rate picture across all key categories of PPE. That's paragraph 75, Mr Brace. And then you explain just a few paragraphs later that burn rate means days remaining of PPE. Do you recall that part of your statement?
Yeah, I think the burn rate probably means two things. It was the rate that stock was getting used up, as well as sort of what stock we had left. One of the two key pieces of data that certainly I was interested in was how quick we were using, I think particularly as guidance was changing, but what that meant in terms of stock held and then how quickly we had to replenish and how much more we had to do to replenish.
I understand that. And as far as you were aware, Mr Brace, did Wales ever run out of PPE at a national level?
Not at any time from my involvement was I aware that we had run out. The military on the 2nd of April said that we hadn't, but there were issues on distribution. And the only other time, actually, probably late April, a call came through to the ministerial team that one of the care homes in one of the local authorities in Wales had run out of PPE and there was none available. I contacted Mark Roscoe in Shared Services, who said that's very unusual because the joint equipment store has been replenished. He sent a van there, and actually the joint equipment store was complete with stock, but there were clearly communication or distribution issues just between that care home, the local authority, and the joint equipment store. So that was the only other occasion that, in my dealings, it was raised with me that we were out of stock.
Thank you. And so to summarise that, what you're saying is the only instance that you're aware of was in fact a false alarm because there was stock. It's just that it hadn't been communicated.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. Members of the group who I represent, Mr Brace, witnessed real shortages of PPE and inadequate PPE. They did so, Mr Brace, in every healthcare setting, hospitals, hospices, care homes. And for them, I'm afraid, they would have felt neither confident nor assured that those who were caring for their loved ones had what they needed. Now, my question is this. From your position as chair of the PPE Sourcing and Distribution Group, can you explain, please, or help us understand, why if Wales never ran out of PPE at a national level, problems were so evident at a local level?
Yeah, and look, not for any sort of effect at all, but my dad died in a care home in April 20 in Wales. So this one, as I've grappled with ever since I was involved with PPE, and I think there were sort of two issues. I think guidance and the changing guidance, I think, caused a lot of tension at the direct service end around what PPE was required and did we have the right mix of PPE. So that was definitely an issue. And I certainly understood before taking up PPE that there were concerns raised with Dr. Andrew Goodall and others around there not being PPE. The only assurance that I could take was the military had said, look, we've checked this and it is, but there are all of those tensions that I just described. I think social care, given the sort of the need to really sort of knit together something a lot more central and to build some central insight and intelligence, I would not sort of really want to comment about sort of every instance of where that was felt in social care.
Just this before I end, Mr Brace, I think you referred to coordination issues at the hospital end about what stock was held and where across sites and within hospitals. So moving away from the care sector to the hospital sector. Mr Brace, this conjures up images of stocks of aprons, FFP3 masks, gloves being stashed in a cupboard somewhere and overlooked by hospital staff. Is that what you intended to convey, or was it something else when you talked about that disconnect?
No, absolutely not. And very early on, I met with all of the PPE leads weekly, but we were in conversation daily. And they always were able to assure me that there was enough stock in all of their locations. Apart, as I said, from I took over about the 23rd of March, so I certainly understood that there were concerns before I took over. After I took over, those concerns never came to sort of any of the groups that I was on or to my personal attention, that there were still issues where it certainly wasn't stock stuffed in cupboards. I think every hospital has got a central receipt and distribution point that then distributes stuff to wards. So there would have been stock in receipt and distribution points, and I guess the challenge was how quickly, and a feeling I think amongst staff as the guidance was changing, was it the right PPE? So they may have felt they were out of PPE, but they were out of a certain type of PPE.
Lastly, this, if I may, just to end, the inquiry heard yesterday, Mr Brace, evidence from a supply chain expert called Professor Manners-Bell, and he said this: not getting goods or PPE to the right place means a critical supply chain failure. You might as well not have bothered to have got those goods in the first place if you're not able to get them to where they're needed at the right time, to the right people. And in respect of that, Mr Brace, do you agree? And was it a failure in supply chain that members of the group witnessed during the pandemic in Wales?
The big issue that I guess confronted me straight away was the emergency planning was based on a push system. So you just pushed out standard packs to the NHS, as an example, and therefore the NHS had to adapt between where that stock was and then distribute, which wasn't how they would normally operate with the shared service. So I think that was absolutely one of the early problems, and one of the lessons for the future is going against a normal way of working was far from helpful.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Brace, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Brace. It must have been really difficult for you to lose your father when you were trying to cope with so many different tasks. I lost count of how many hats you were wearing, but I'm really sorry to hear that he died near a care home. So thank you very much indeed for all that you tried to do during the pandemic and for all the help you've given to the inquiry. And a safe journey back to Wales.
Thank you, my lady.
Very well. I shall return at 10 o'clock tomorrow.